Nigeria's rising debt burden has continued to elicit heated public debate as public and private sector experts express concerns over the country's fiscal sustainability amidst dwindling national revenue. According to the latest data from the Debt Management Office, the country's public debt profile has risen by 1.24 trillion naira to stand at 42.84 for 2.84 trillion naira as at June 2022. This represents the external, domestic and external shocks of the federal government, the 36 states government and federal capital territory. On the other hand, the country has spent 6.16 trillion naira on debt service in the past 6 months. With Nigeria's debt on the rise and putting the country at fiscal risk amid constant decline in oil production, coupled with challenges of low revenue that have failed to keep pace with growing expenditure, the need to explore alternative financing options such as expanding the tax net for more revenue increase, internal generated revenue, public-private partnership, and attracting more foreign direct investment cannot be overemphasized. Well, let's get talking now. First, I'm being joined by Zoom by economic and investment strategist, Mr. Ayoride Akinloye. Mr. Akinloye, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure you listened to President Buhari. Let's start on that note with what is happening in the United States. What are your expectations after how we can improve relations? Before we start to talk about debt, which is something that is staring us in the eyes.
Okay, well, in terms of improving our external relations with the outside world, definitely I think Nigeria is one of the countries that has managed to sort of stay away from a lot of the issues that we've had in the past, say, 1 to 2 years in terms of the geopolitics, particularly when you look at what has happened with the Russia and Ukraine crisis, and also what is happening across, in terms of other bodies coming to vote, on certain key issues as regards how the external country or external community should respond to those crises. And that has been, sort of positive for us. Now, in terms of moving forward to improve our relationship or how we sort of relate with other countries, it's about looking at how we can harness opportunities in partnering with them. For example, we have a lot of these countries are more advanced than us in terms of their markets, their economies, their, in terms of power generation, in terms of infrastructure. So there's a lot of partnership we can go into working with governments of these other countries to sort of implement, to sort of guide us on how to implement some of those key reforms. So those are the ways that I think we can really explore to sort of improve our relationship and sort of get the most out of relating with, multilateral bodies and other external the external community.
Interesting stuff from you, as usual. But let's move quickly to issues around COVID-19, Russian war, and all of that the president identified. Some say these are some justifications for Nigeria to keep borrowing and having this high debt profile. Do you agree to that, Ayo?
Well, there's for those who argue in favor of more borrowing from the governments, they always have their reasons, considering the fact that, okay, revenue has been dwindling, and as a result of that, there's always a need to sort of, to shore that up by borrowing to ensure that we're able to implement our budgets. But I think when we look at it holistically, a lot of the funds that we've been borrowing very effectively in terms of, if you look at historically, for the past about 7 to 8 years, from 2015 down to 2021, the total budget deficit has been about roughly about 30 trillion. If you sum the total budget deficit over the past 7 years, it's been about 30 trillion. When you exclude government operating enterprises, then maybe that will come down to about 25 trillion. But when you look at how much you've spent on capital expenditure within that same time frame, it's a bit less than about 10 trillion naira. So when you compare that, it means we've spent just roughly about 35% of all the total amount of money that we have borrowed over the past 7 years. Only about 30% of that has been spent on capital projects that, have the potential to generate more cash flows. So when we look at how we have spent the money we have borrowed in the past, one, it's not enough justification to say, oh, we can go ahead to borrow more because we are going to use it to fund projects that will generate more cash flows in the future. Two is when there is a principle in finance, in personal finance, as an individual, you have to spend within your means. What that means is, if you're earning 100,000 naira a month, you won't say, oh, because the economy is tight and things are not looking good, then you go ahead to spend 150,000 naira a month. Instead, you will try to ensure you're able to manage your expenses to stay within the amounts that you earn. So the fact that the external conditions are not looking favorable, inflation is, jumping, there's a need for a lot of infrastructural developments in Nigeria, being a developing economy, it's still not enough to justify borrowing at the current level that we are at. So, because when you look at our debt service to revenue ratio, based on the last available data from the Ministry of Finance, we're talking about somewhere close to about 120%, which means currently, whatever new borrowings we are taking, we are using to fund, debt service on the previous debts that we are owing. Two is, again, unfortunately, a lot of these debts that we are taking are not guaranteed to generate future cash flows, which is not what you typically expect for a corporate. So a private company goes to the market, maybe raises a bond, borrows money from the capital market, or approaches a bank to borrow money. A lot of those funds are deployed straight into, activities and business investments that will generate more revenue for the company in the future, which they will now be able to pay the debt out of in terms of more cash flow. But that is not the case for Nigeria. Just speaking to the statistics that I mentioned earlier, in terms of about less than 35% of how much of the funds you have borrowed have gone into capital projects. So when you look at all these figures, they basically bring in light the fact that debt sustainability should be the key watchword of the government right now, and prudent spending should be the key watchword for the federal government right now and other key subnational governments also. And borrowing more, and basically pushing the country more and more towards the edge of fiscal crisis is not going to be justified by negative external conditions.
You are already as usual. But let's look at what the IMF has said. And how worried are you saying that debt service might go up 100% of the federal government's revenue by 2026 if government fails to implement adequate measures to improve revenue generation? And on the other side, we have that argument that the issue is not about debt, it's about revenue crisis. Which do we believe? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Okay, interesting. So the fiscal situation of Nigeria there's always been a lot of argument. A school of thought will say Nigeria has a revenue problem. Another school of thought will say Nigeria has a spending problem. I think the truth is we just have to admit the fact that we have both problems. We have both a revenue problem and we have a spending problem, and we can't do without the two. The reason why a poor person is poor is because they're not making enough money, and at the same time they still have basic needs that they have to meet. So that's basically the situation of Nigeria. We need to construct roads, we need to develop infrastructure, we need to build more security around our oil infrastructure in order to prevent us losing more revenue in the future. We need to generate more revenue in order to be able to pay the civil service and things like that. But at the same time, we are not earning enough. We are losing crude oil production. We are not generating enough tax revenue. There's not enough investments going into the business sector that would enable businesses to generate more profit and pay taxes that would then increase government's non-oil revenue. So we have both problems in terms of we have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. Now, when you're faced with these two issues, the first thing you have to do is you have to tackle the spending problem first. So the first thing is get your house in order, cut down excess expenditure, try and block every leakage that exists within your revenue collection. That's in terms of the revenue problem side of things. But in the spending problem side of things, we need to look at, for example, cost of governance. We run a very elaborate government system in Nigeria compared to a lot of other countries that have our size of resources or our size of revenue that we generate annually. So we need to look into that. How can we run our governments more efficiently? How can we run our governments more in a more efficient and effective manner, such that they're able to discharge their duties effectively, but at the same time, we're able to manage the resources that we have. That's something we need to look into. Another thing we also have to look into is in terms of, how we run our agencies, the departments and other ministries, across all the different sectors of the economy. You know, the NCC in telecommunications, the NRC in railway. You know, all the different transport agencies. You know, and all different agencies in health, in banking, in finance, and all the likes. You know, how do we run them more efficiently? How do we make them more accountable? Because a lot of these agencies are actually spending, you know, way beyond what you would consider would be an optimal, or you know, what you consider as you know, the bare minimum for them to run at an efficient level. They are spending way more than that. So there's a need for us to be able to live within our means. Then when we are able to achieve that, it means there won't be so much pressure for us to begin to borrow to fund unnecessary things. So I mean, you called me earlier when I was talking. I said a government budget deficit has been about 30 trillion, which implies that they've borrowed about 30 trillion over the past 7 years. And that excludes the ways and means that they've been taken from the CBN, which, you know, is anywhere between 15 to 20 trillion as we speak today. But when you look at the amount of those borrowings that have gone into investments, less than 35% of that has gone into investments, meaning 65% of that have either been used to sort of maybe finance, you know, debt payments, or has also been used to fund recurrent expenditure like paying salaries, you know, running government activities and things like that. So these are all issues. You know, if you're spending such a huge chunk of your borrowings to fund those kind of activities, then there's a huge problem in terms of how you're running the government. So those are things that we need to look into to control our spending. We have fuel subsidy there. We are spending about 6 trillion on fuel subsidy. We are going to spend about 6 trillion this year. You know, based on the initial prognosis for the 2023 budget, we're estimating that even though the subsidy program is going to run from just January to June, we're going to be spending close to another 6 trillion. So if we take that out alone, that is a significant burden off the neck of the government. You know, there is hardly any country in the world, you know, just very few countries in the world subsidize petrol consumption and the like. So these are all issues that we need to look into to alleviate the spending problem. From there, we can now move to the revenue problem to say, how can we improve revenue generation? You know, first of all, how do we block the leakages? You know, some government agencies don't even report their revenue. I recall about 3 weeks ago or so, the Senate Committee on Finance held a meeting with a couple of the heads of different agencies, and we saw how a lot of these agencies have been under-reporting the revenues that they've been making. A lot of them have not been remitting anything to the federation account. So these are all leakages that needs to be blocked. We need to look at how we can take advantage of all the other revenue sources that the federal government can sort of generate revenue from, you know, like mining, you know, even solving the oil theft issue, such that we're able to get back to the days of producing 1.92 million barrels per day instead of the about 1 million barrels per day that we are doing right now, excluding condensates. And so these are all issues that can then be tackled to sort of solve the revenue problem. And then from there, we are getting started, and we can now begin to place ourselves on the path of fiscal sustainability going forward.
Because of course, time, we had to listen to President Buhari live from the United States, and that took part of our time. But if we can do this in just 2 minutes, what other options do we have if we are not to borrow at this time?
Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, Nigeria currently, the rate at which we borrow, the truth is Nigeria does not need to borrow at that rate right now. And for us to, the other alternative to not borrowing is putting our house in order, like I mentioned earlier. I mean, we are borrowing to fund expenditure that we actually should not be funding. You know, we are spending 6 trillion to fund for subsidy every year. This is a revenue that should be coming to the government. You know, if NNPC is not having to deduct that to fund for subsidy, that is the revenue that would have actually come into the position of the government and will be shared between the federal government, the state governments, and all. And as a result of that, it reduces the need for the government to borrow. The next thing, the spending issue. Cut all the excess weights that we're carrying. We need to cut our quotes according to our size and run a lean government, a lean and efficient government as much as possible. And this is not a pipe dream. It's not rocket science. It's not unrealistic. The truth is, we know a lot of these excesses, you know, in terms of certain fundings that we do that we are not meant to be doing, you know, particularly when it relates to the governance structure, our democratic structure, and things like that. These are all excesses that we need to cut off in order for the government to not have to borrow to fund them. And then when we're able to do this, the outside community, you know, investors, financiers, external financiers, they're able to perceive us and say, oh, Nigeria is really serious about getting on the path of fiscal sustainability. And then you can now approach these institutions to say, can we restructure some of our debt payments? Maybe, for example, give us a moratorium in terms of principal payments for 3 years, or, let's stop interest payments for 3 years, 4 years, in some cases, even get debt forgiveness, because they're already seeing the seriousness to implement reforms. And that would reduce the burden and will give us further headroom to even say we want to borrow if we need to in the future. So those are the key things we need to look into. And the last thing is we need to improve revenue generation. And in the long run, we can't run away from that. We need to improve our revenue generation. We need to get back to our peak oil production of 2 million barrels per day. We need to ensure that we are able to bring more people into the tax net and make more businesses accountable in terms of payment of their taxes. We need to ensure that individuals, particularly high net worth individuals, who many a times, we say that many of them are guilty in terms of not paying their taxes, right? So we need to get these people into the tax net to also improve tax revenue generation. So these are all bits that the federal government can do, from the revenue angle in order to boost revenue generation in the long run. And finally, there will be a significant need to partner with the private investor community to sort of, make a significant breakthrough, particularly in the mining sector and in the agricultural space, because those are two key places where Nigeria has significant potential and we are currently not tapping into in terms of earning royalties in mining, and also in terms of agriculture, adding value to a lot of the raw agri products that we export. Those are all opportunities for federal government to partner with farmers and commercial investors to improve the value chain and, generate revenue in terms of taxes, in terms of profit sharing with, in terms of maybe establishing joint ventures similar to what we have in the oil and gas industry. So those are just things that we can look at doing that would reduce our need to borrow in the next couple of years.
Beautiful stuff. Well, we're still able to make use of the time available. I've been speaking to economic and investment strategist, Mr. Ayorinde Akinloye. Thank you so much. I do enjoy the rest of your day. I sincerely appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Tolizon.